Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is 10:06. Happy Friday the 13th. So yeah, I uploaded just just a few minutes ago. I uploaded in celebration of Friday the 13th. I uploaded a video on my favorite actor who's ever played Jason Voorhees, who graced the big screen, and that is Ted White, who played Jason Voorhees in Part 4, the final chapter. Pretty much my favorite movie in the entire franchise, and Ted White is the man. I did a pretty, tried to do an in-depth video about his background. I mean, just an amazing career, both mainly as a stunt man and then as an actor. Just amazing. So, and being that today is Friday 13th, I figured, well, okay, I gotta upload this video today. This is an important day or holiday for me, or a holiday for here at Film Fanatic headquarters. Also, tonight I'm super excited because I'm going to go see Friday the 13th, the final chapter, on the big screen at Black Bear Cinema. I'm super stoked. It's a 7 o'clock show. I went about, I think it was like 3 or 4 weeks ago. I went with some friends to go see Part 3, Friday the 13th, Part 3, 3D. I was totally blown away by the whole experience. It was one of the funnest experiences I've had in recent time going to the movies. There was a really big, pretty packed crowd there. I was really inspired seeing that there were a lot of kids there, like college kids, maybe even younger, high school kids, maybe. But they were all totally into the movie, and it felt like the vibe that I got was that everybody there had you definitely seen the movie before, and everybody was just totally in a good mood. People were talking, to the screen, to the characters out loud, screaming and yelling and laughing their asses off. I mean, it was just great. It was totally interactive, and I miss that. I remember that being kind of a thing back in the day when movies would come out, where people would react to the movies and get an experience, and it would be this interactive thing. A lot of the times now, and again, I loved going to movies more than in my free time and whatnot. That's you know what I love doing when I have the free time, or there's a weekend and there's something going on. I always love to go see live music if I can, get some beers with a friend or two. And in this case, mainly I love going to the movies so much that that's probably my preferred thing to do in my free time or spare time. It's just so much fun. But I remember back in the day, that was a thing where people would react, and I do find, even though the experience for me going to the movies is still really incredible, I feel like it's not like it used to be. And I know you can't, when things change, things shift. You can't, maybe the magic's not there anymore. You can't go back to it. It's just kind of how things play out. But I think generally now people, when they watch films, I mean, I should say there have been experiences this year and last year with a few movies that I did go see in the theater, where it caused people to react, and you could hear and you could feel the vibe of what the movie was doing to the audience. But it doesn't happen as often, and it's not as powerful as it used to be, because I think generally people now are kind of reserved, and I think even too when you go to a lot of concerts, people are people are kind of reserved more than they used to be. They're not as wild and crazy and as interactive. It's a little bit more of a passive kind of a thing. It's kind of funny. But that doesn't always happen. That's not always the case. So I'm really excited to see what this will be like tonight. I'm gonna go up with a buddy of mine, and there might be one or two other people coming. And we were talking about the plan for today and tonight to go up to Orono. Orono is about an hour and 10 minutes or so from here, from Northport where I live, but it's worth it. I mean, yeah, it's a little ways to go to drive to go see a movie, but fuck it. It's Friday 13th, and again, it's my favorite movie. So I'm really excited to see what this will be like. Because the quality of part 3 on the big screen was impeccable. When I went there, I didn't know that this was part of a whole series that Black Bear Cinema started. And it's kind of odd that because I do believe it was the first movie for this whole series. But we went to the movie, and then afterwards we were talking to the manager, and he said, "Yeah, this is the first movie, more or less, of the series that we're going to do. Where on every time monthly, it's that it lines up where we are, on when every date late lands on Friday the 13th, we're going to show a Friday 13th movie. So their goal was to show every movie on the actual date, which is I was just like, that's amazing. So so today is Friday 13th, and tonight they're going to be showing the final chapter. I was surprised they didn't show the first one, obviously first, and just go from there. But either way, I'm super stoked, super stoked. And we were talking, my friend and I, we were talking last night about just how fun it was seeing part 3 in the screen, at this movie theater, because people were totally into it. And I was saying, hoping we get that kind of vibe tonight. The other thing I came away from that experience was like, I love, and I try to stay up on new movies, of course, new horror films. But a lot of the times I feel like the old school stuff is, I don't know, not talked about enough or taken for granted, that kind of thing. And it's a generational thing. For me, again, I always traditionally go into, I'm kind of an old school guy. I love movies from the 70s and 80s the most. And then try to go, even into the 60s. I love to explore to see, movies that I love in the 70s, for instance, that were probably greatly inspired by movies, maybe decades before they came out. So I love to kind of trace the lineage, and especially with horror films and exploitation movies. But it's not, you can do that with westerns. You can really do that with, any kind of genre. But I really love doing that. But at the same time, those are my favorite decades. The 70s and 80s. That's my favorite period of film. But I try to always stay up on new things that come out and see them. Obviously, when I go to the movies, for the most part, they're all new, modern movies. And I never try to play that card as much as I am kind of an old school man and an old man. I try never to play that card of like, well, nothing good comes out now, and they don't make them like they used to. I think there are exceptions to that. I think there are certain movies that don't that probably couldn't get made today to a degree. And today I'm gonna change things up today. I'm gonna do a video on a movie. This is gonna be another deep dive video, and this won't be a Friday 13th movie. Just kind of change things up, but I still have more movies to get to. But every now and today, I think is today's movie that I'm going to be talking about is kind of an example of that, of where I think that this movie probably couldn't really get made today for various reasons. But I do think that there are extraordinarily great and fantastic new horror films that have come out, and I never play the card of, I do find myself defending new cinema a lot. The two things that really fire me up or get me fired up, defensive, or maybe even kind of pissed off, but where I'll defend it, is usually when people really shit on exploitation movies to the point of where, well, I guess you could say when people are all outwardly offended by art, by films, and then it kind of goes into this place of like where, for me, it leads to this slippery slope of where sometimes people take that stance, and then I wonder, like, okay, are they calling for, censorship, or saying that these movies shouldn't be made or seen, or like in light of like, could what about if these movies were made today? Would they not be allowed? Should they not get funded? So it's always a slippery slope. But I'm always amazed by how people get so offended and won't even, you know, it will be a lot of the times I find it's the case that it's something that they haven't actually experienced. So I get pretty worked up about those kinds of things, especially when, when people play that whole card that movies are, promoting violence in society, antisocial behavior, promoting rape and violence against women and murder and mayhem. When people outwardly say that those films are condoning it, that's a different thing. And then also, that gets me really fired up. Not too many things get me to the point of where I'm going to engage with people on social media when they start saying that kind of bullshit. But I will do it because I really love film so much, and I really think that it's a really, um, it's an awful thing. I believe when that happens, especially at the end of the day when people are attacking films or genre films, especially when at the end of the day these are, it's the land of make believe. These are films after all. So it's a little bit insane when you consider the world, the actual, all you have to do is turn on the news for about 5 seconds, or get exposed to the news for 5 seconds, and which typically happens to me when I see the news, whether I want to or not. Within 5 minutes of seeing the news, I want to hang myself in the highest fucking tree. So, and I'm like, okay, why does cinema, why does art always get fucking attacked and bombarded when the reality of what we actually experience, life is still wonderful, but I think the reality when it comes to the socio-political things that we are going through are truly nightmarish. And so I'm like, where's that misdirected energy? Like, really? Is that because it's an easy target? And I just think it's bullshit. But anyway, and the other thing that I get pretty riled up about is when people play that card or continually say that, oh, there's no good movies and stay home. Don't go to the cinema. People are assholes. People, all they want to do is text and talk to their douchebag friends on the phone, on their phone, and they can't put their phones away, and they have no attention span, and people are rude. Ticket prices for movies are just so outlandish, and just the overall quality of new films suck, and I'm just like, and that really irritates me because it's like there's phases, like there's times of where, there's lulls, and maybe there aren't a whole bunch of new things coming out that are great, but then you're always surprised. And I think in the span of, especially last year, 2025 was outrageously fantastic as far as films. I get pretty worked up about that because I'm like, no, you're clearly, you know, pretty ignorant about this subject, and I think you're criticizing something. again, you don't understand, and you're not. And a lot of these movies that have come out, you probably haven't actually even seen. So anyway, those are things that happen. But so today's show, I'm going to take a little bit. This is going to be another deep dive episode, and I'm going to talk about. I did review this movie before, but I just think this movie. I think it's one of the greatest slasher movies of all time. I wanted to kind of go into it and explore. This is like another deep dive, if you will, edition of a movie that I have talked about, and that is the classic Sleepaway Camp, one of the greatest slasher movies of all time. So I wanted to talk about this movie in a little bit more of a detailed way. I started doing these deep dive videos maybe a month or two ago, and the first movie I did a deep dive on was The Howling, which is my favorite werewolf movie of all time. And these are all movies I have talked about, but I do feel like, you know, I rewatch a lot of these movies. Well, I rewatch them all the time. And I find as a fan, I I learn a lot more about these films. There's things that I didn't pick up on maybe the first few times I got to see them. And I do feel like a lot of these movies also mean something a little bit different to me, at different stages of when I saw it. Like Sleepaway Camp, I remember seeing it a bunch of times when I was a kid. It was definitely one of the slasher movies that I saw really at a really young age that made an impression on me. And watching it now fart, as an old fart, it is I kind of enjoy it even more. And I think there's a lot of things in this movie. It's a pretty twisted fucking movie, I will say. I watched it again the other night. I got this really beautiful Blu-ray edition of this movie. I got this Sleepaway Camp at least 2 years ago, but this is, I not that I have ever forgotten, but I really think that this is if you're a fan of slasher films, and I do think that this movie does get a pretty good amount of praise and notoriety, and it's also a fairly big franchise. I believe that there are 3 to 4 movies in the franchise. I could be wrong. I haven't seen all of them. I know I did see at least Sleepaway Camp 2. I don't know if I've seen the other ones, and I do believe there's at least 3, there might be 4. This is the only movie I have in the franchise on Blu-ray, but I really do think that if you're a fan of low budget, sleazy, exploitation, slasher movies, this is one of the best, easily one of the best slasher movies of all time. And the subject matter in the movie, the watching it now, I mean, watching it when I was a kid, a lot of some of the areas that this movie explores and some of the really vile things in this movie probably it's probably safe to say they were kind of over my head at the time because I was unaware of some of these like really kind of gross subject matters or taboos. But seeing it now, I feel like this movie has almost more of an impact on me now watching it as an old man because it touches on a lot of taboos. I mean, one of the most forbidden things, and it still is in films, or subject matters that are covered by films, are subjects, dealing with the death of children or murderous children. So this movie is all about that. And there is one scene in particular in Sleepaway Camp that I forgot how kind of brutal this movie is. And when you consider, this is an American-made slasher film that came out in 1983, and watching it now, again, there was this one sequence in this movie that I forgot, and that is a scene involving the death of kids. That's still like today a real envelope pushing kind of subject or area to kind of explore in a film. It's still a taboo. It's still a very frightening thing, and I've always found that the idea of like you know kids who kill, or kids who are murderous, or kids who are psychopaths, and they like kill the adults or kill other kids, as being really terrifying. Like that's, to me, is a really terrifying kind of concept or idea. And the other one of the other things I've always felt is like one of the most kind of terrifying, possible scenarios is like the idea of like home invasion, like being kept captive in your house by like a mass killer. I've always felt those two things are really intense and actually terrifying and scary. And this movie deals with a lot of sexual uh, taboos. I mean, one of the main characters in the beginning of this movie is a pedophile. It also deals with kids who are really basically morally destroyed and corrupted and abused by their parents. It gets into identity, sexual identity. This movie was also incredibly controversial. I think it's if this movie was to come out now, it would be really controversial, but because essentially when it comes down to it, one of the things, the biggest thing of this movie, for this movie, Sleepaway Camp has, I think, one of the most shocking and one of the most kind of terrifying ends to a movie in slasher movie history, or in general horror movie history. It's really disturbing and totally gets under your skin, and it deals with essentially there's the reveal of that the killer in Sleepaway Camp is a transgender person, and it does deal with issues of alternative sexual lifestyles, being gay, and then also just the adults, how just awful they are. The adults in Sleepaway Camp are probably the worst part of this movie, like as far as how kind of disgusting and gross that they are. It deals with child abuse, but it really is a movie that, even like, well, especially even by today's standards, really does push the envelope. There's some really great special features on this Blu-ray that I got. There's a really great interview with the director of Sleepaway Camp, Robert Hilsick, and he was talking about this was his first movie he ever directed, and again this movie came out in 1984. Right, the prime time, the mid early to mid 80s, or I should say 1983. It came out right at the height, right as the whole slasher movie, just that whole genre just exploded. When you go back to the 80s and you revisit some of these slasher movies, and you have the movies that are popular, the movies that kind of hit pretty hard, but then you discover there are so many other slasher movies that were kind of under the radar, but this sheer amount of slasher movies that came out is just like insane. And you have a span of like from like 79 to about maybe 1985, 86. During that time frame, like, it's insane how many slasher movies that came out. I mean, you had movies that were commercially popular, or just really well known. The Friday 13th franchise, of course, Halloween, the Nightmare on Elm Street films. even though I do feel like they are definitely those that franchise and those movies are slasher movies. I don't know. I kind of look at them differently than say a movie like Sleepaway Camp. Sleepaway Camp was a massive hit when it came out, and you had, you know, a whole slew of other great films. My Bloody Valentine was another huge hit. Maniac. I mean, there's so many great movies. But then you had other movies like Mad Men, or even movies like Nightmare that were kind of more underground or lesser known slasher films. But so many came out, and the special features on Sleepaway Camp, this disc, are just tremendous. Really, really great. And there's a really great interview with Robert Hilsick where he talks about this. Sleepaway Camp was his first feature film, and he just wanted to make something that, because at that time in the early 80s, the slasher film had just been, just taken over genre wise. He was like, okay, the key to success, or the thing I should do to kind of get my name out there is I should make a horror film, make a slasher movie. And their whole, his whole reasoning behind it, he goes into detail about slasher movies compared to other genre films where you can make them a lot cheaper. You could do them, really, independently. You didn't need a big studio to back you. You could do them really independently for a low budget, and you could find actors at, various levels, and you could just kind of make it happen and just do it, and try to get it distributed, get a good distribution deal, hopefully, and then maybe get, a name, something established. And so that's what happened. And Robert Hilsig was talking about that's what they wanted to do. Like, that was the intention. And again, it's an exploitation movie, so more or less, first and foremost, that's what an exploitation movie is. So, and that's what they set out. But Robert Hilsig said that he didn't have any intentions on, going into creating and directing Sleepaway Camp. He didn't have any intentions of like, oh, I'm going to turn this into some big kind of slasher franchise, which it did. He just wanted to make a good, cheaply made slasher movie and try to capitalize on this wave that was happening and make it really cheap. But he also said he really wanted to do something different in the genre. And, too often, which is something I've talked about a lot, which, there's part of it's true. I mean, the whole thing with stereotypes, why stereotypes exist or what have you. There's always, with every stereotype, there's always some, kernel of truth behind it. There's something there. But generally, that kind of thing is, stereotypes are mainly based on falsehoods and things that people don't really want to understand or can't understand, or maybe they're not even capable of understanding. So, there's that. But he wanted to do something different because I do think at the end of the day, a lot of people just, people who are not fans of slasher movies and horror exploitation movies, they more or less have this, view of slasher films as just being total, total trash, and every movie is just a carbon copy of the next movie, and that there's no, like, none of the movies actually have any, I guess, long lasting power, or maybe even have some kind of impactful thing behind them, or that there's no quality behind it, and they're just like carbon copy blood and guts films that are just disposable, and they're just bullshit. And so a lot of times I've had that conversation with people where they'll just totally dispose them and say, well, they're just every slasher movie is the same. They're all just crap, and they're cheaply made. They're forgettable, and only perverts and psychos watch them, and it's just so ridiculous. But I really think when you get into the genre, yeah, there are obviously Robert Hilsig is talking about that. He wanted to capitalize. First and foremost, he's in the business of exploitation. So he's going to, a lot of these directors are going to capitalize on what is kind of popular. I've always talked about that, where you had, 70s and the 80s, you had a series of, big movies that came out that were kind of cultural moments for cinema, and often in the exploitation world, those directors are going to try to like get a piece of that, but make those films in a much cheaper way, and the films are going to be maybe more of a gorier version or a sleazier version of that film. I mean, some of the most ripped off movies ever, in regards to that kind of situation, movies like Jaws, Steven Spielberg's Jaws. That's a movie that's really been really well influential, but also ripped off big time when it comes to exploitation. And then The Exorcist is another movie. Rosemary's Baby would be another one I would say. These were big kind of Hollywood movies at the time that were horror films, and they're fantastic and they're classics. But they were at that time; these were big budget box office hits. So, but I often find that when you look at a lot of these movies, they're actually these movies that were ripping off these said movies, and they're done for very cheap. I often find that like, well, these movies are really their own thing. The two examples, and I've talked about this before, but I think it's worth mentioning. Maniac, Bill Lustig's Maniac, or even The Car, two movies that were essentially rip-offs to a degree of Steven Spielberg's Jaws. And these were two kind of exploitation movies that were made, as one being, well, they're both slasher movies, really. And I love those movies to death, and Maniac is my favorite slasher movie of all time. But when you get down to it and you actually watch those movies, they are, it's so obvious what they're influenced by, or what they're taking or stealing ideas from. But when you get down to the nitty gritty, those movies are so unique and different, I think, and they do their own thing. They're not like they're not exactly carbon copies of something that came before. And I think that they do something unique, and the car has its own vibe. It's a total Jaws ripoff, but it's got its own vibe. Maniac, the greatest slasher movie ever made. Totally, totally inspired by Jaws, especially the whole opening sequence. But it's its own thing. It's its own thing, and it's a unique thing. And I think that happens with slasher films is that when you get down to actually watching these movies, they're pretty different from each other. If you look at My Bloody Valentine and then you watch a movie like today's show, Sleepaway Camp, there are those tropes that we expect and that we see. A cabin in the woods, or in this case, a camp. This was obviously influenced. Friday the 13th had a massive influence on this movie, but it's its own thing. It's really, I think it has its own thing. And I do feel that a lot of slasher movies don't get the credit that they deserve, because I feel like they actually do. Every movie that I own, and the slasher genre is my favorite, I feel that they each have, when you get down to it, they each have their own kind of personality, and they're actually kind of all doing their own thing. they're not just a copy and paste kind of scenario. And I think that that happens a lot with people on the outside that are really dismissive of slasher movies. And it's, on the other hand, too, they are schlock. They are, kind of shitty movies. They're kind of, terrible, and they're super sleazy. They're just nasty, and you can't take it that seriously because they're just fucking movies. But I think that it's a little bit of all those things for me, So, but I'll defend them because I do feel, even though it's total schlock and trash, they they're fucking awesome. So I would and will defend that. So, but I think Robert Hilsig, what he did with, he said, in this really great interview, he obviously wanted to cash in on what was happening at the time in the '80s with the slasher explosion. But he intended on trying to make Sleepaway Camp really unique and really different. One of the things that he talks about in this interview was, in a lot of other slasher movies and horror movies at the time, he was talking about one of the trends that a lot of directors were doing was if their particular movie that they were doing, where they were going to involve, have young actors or kids in the story, or like say high school kids or college kids, typically they would hire adults, older actors to play much younger roles. And Robert Hilsig was talking about how he didn't really dig that. He wanted to make it a little bit more authentic. So what he intentionally did was he actually hired kids to play kids and to play themselves. So it gives it more of a more grounded, realistic situation of how kids are. And it really is that. I mean, and the other thing that's so hilarious about this movie, when it comes to like potty mouth language or movies that have a lot of cursing in them, this movie I think it must have, I think it's got the most fucking hilarious. Some of the dialogue in this movie is so funny and it's so over the top. But I think that pound for pound, Sleepaway Camp has the most profanity and potty mouth language more than any other movie that I've ever seen. Like, really. I mean, maybe like, when I think of a movie that has like, where every other word is motherfucker or cunt, or, just nasty potty mouth language and dropping the F bomb every 5 seconds. When I think of maybe like, movies like, say, Raging Bull might be that kind of movie, one of those movies, or definitely like a Scorsese movie. Goodfellas has that, where there's a lot of cursing and shit in it. But I feel like Sleepaway Camp has got the most, like literally every other word is a total profanity, and it's hilarious how much of it that there is in this movie. I always forget on how much just sheer profanity that there is in this movie. And the other thing that I love, which I think was one of the best things that Robert Hilsig did with this movie, is the casting, because the cast for this movie is just awesome. But it really feels like this is how kids are. If you get a group of kids together that are, more or less teenagers, or they're becoming teenagers, and they're kind of, becoming independent of their families and their moms and dads, and they're hanging out with their peers, this is how kids talk. This is how kids interact. And so I just feel like that whole way of telling the story, as far as like portraying how kids are, adolescents, and then kids that are more or less just about becoming a teenager, or they are teenagers. This is like how kids really are. dropping the F bomb all the time, hanging out with their buddies, fighting with other kids, just being totally, crazy, you little psychopaths. And I feel like I do think that this movie is probably the most accurate portrayal, even though it's a totally low budget, sleazy, slasher movie. I do feel in a lot of ways that this movie is probably the most accurate kind of portrayal of what kids are like when they're together with their friends and peers, especially teenagers. It's so spot on, and because I never see kids really portrayed this way, because I really feel like that's how kids are. And it does get into that whole well, the psychology of how kids are, and how essentially their brains are not fully developed, so they don't really have a sense of ethics or responsibility or morality, or being responsible in any way. Their brains are still developing, so they don't know what that is, or that's such a foreign concept to them. So essentially, these kids in their development are psychopaths, and so there's a cool glimpse of that in this movie, how kids are just you know awful to each other, and it really does on just a no bullshit great thing of just showing this is how adolescence, and it's a normal thing, and it's a natural thing that every kid goes through, every social group of kids and teenagers, that what they go through, even though it's awful. The other thing is it showcases well, not showcases, but it does show how these kids, the bullying aspects of how kids are so awful to each other at a certain age, and they're just so ruthless. And it gets into that kind of whole Lord of the Flies thing of where you know that kind of tribal thing of the other kid has got to outpower, outman the other person, and there has to be a leader in that tribe. And it gets into that kind of whole Lord of the Flies kind of thing. And I think as far as, even aside from it being just one of the best and one of the most essential slasher movies, like if you're a slasher, if you consider yourself a fan of slasher movies, this is an essential movie. Like, if you don't like Sleepaway Camp, I feel like you're not really a slasher movie fan. Like, it's essential. I think it's one of the best. I think it's one of the greatest, and I think it's one of the top tier slasher movies. And there's a shit ton of them. But I do think that if someone is walking around and saying, "Well, I really love slasher films," and they have no idea what Sleepaway Camp is, or they've never seen it, or they don't watch it, or they don't like it, they should just cancel that, because they're not really slasher fans. So I think it's such an essential movie, like, without a doubt. It's kind of like saying, if you don't like, you really love movies that are about organized crime and the mafia, but yet you don't really like Martin Scorsese. It's like, no, thank you. But Robert Hilzig said that he really wanted this movie to feel real as far as the portrayal of kids, and I really think, aside from it just being an amazing and just awesome, you know, slasher movie, I think it's, for my money, it's probably the most accurate portrayal of how kids are, especially with you know, without any real supervision, if they're kind of left to their own devices. And the adults, the other thing that's pretty funny and but then kind of scary and pretty accurate, are the adults in this movie, because the adults in this movie are just like total fucking shitheads. And there is this revenge factor. All of these people in here in this movie that are kind of just really gross and terrible people, including some of the kids, that all eventually get killed and picked off in various gruesome ways. You really have, even before the great big shocking reveal of who the killer is at the end of the movie, you're like, man, that motherfucker deserved that. That other frickin' person deserved that too. Like, it feels there's something satisfying about the kills in this movie where that makes it a little bit more unique in for the slasher genre, because sometimes obviously in slasher movies kids or people are killed, indiscriminately, and there's no maybe, and because the killer is essentially a psychopath, so there might not be, it's not justified. But in this movie, I will say that I had this experience of like, yep, that person really deserves. I want to see them die a horrible death. Good, that's awesome. So the Sleepaway Camp has a unique thing where it makes it, you're very, found myself really having had a lot of empathy towards kind of the motivation as to these people getting picked off, and I'm like, yep, they deserve it. 2 thumbs up, I approve. So it's got that, which is a little bit unique in the slasher genre, because a lot of other slasher movies don't really necessarily have that for obvious reasons. And this brings me back to one thing that happened to me. This actually happened quite a while ago. I do believe I got Sleepaway Camp. I bought this beautiful edition. I think this was put out by Scream Factory. Beautiful, beautiful Blu-ray edition. I again, I had seen this movie. This was a slasher movie that was a big part of my youth. I used to see it. I saw it a whole bunch of times as a kid, mostly on VHS, and then it was on late night cable shows like HBO and what have you. So it was definitely a slasher movie I had seen many many times, but I don't think I had ever gotten a chance to really see it on DVD. And when I picked this movie up, it was probably like 2 or 3 years ago. I came across it at Bull Moose, and I'm like, yeah, Sleepaway Camp. I mean, it's essential. I need to see it. I've never seen it on DVD. I've never seen it on Blu-ray, and I picked it up. It was amazing. And again, going back to that experience that I talk about before, that I've said many times, seeing a lot of these great classic movies of my youth, seeing them again as an adult, it's always, especially on Blu-ray, it's like watching it for the first time. It's a whole new experience, and I enjoy it even more. And then also with subject matter, especially with Sleepaway Camp, it has a deeper level where it resonates a little bit more, and I'm like, oh wow, I did not pick up on this when I saw this movie when I was 11 or 12 years old. No way. Or even younger. And watching it now, it's like, oh shit, okay, I didn't realize that was going on in the movie. That's crazy, or that's kind of fucked up. So it's a whole different experience watching it now. So, but watching Sleepaway Camp, it had been years and years and years and years since I had seen it. So it was really, really great. And it's a Shout Factory release, I believe. So, yeah, just absolutely, absolutely essential, absolutely fantastic. But I do believe it was about 2 years ago when I bought it. And then I did a review on it when I got the movie, like I usually do. So I did a review for Sleepaway Camp probably at least 2 years ago. And I came across a YouTube channel. I can't remember who the person is, but it was somebody I came across randomly on YouTube. It was right around the time, I think, when I had done a video on like a review or a talk on Sleepaway Camp, and I came across this one person who was transgender. They had a YouTube channel, and they were doing a review on Sleepaway Camp, and they were basically kind of saying two things, somewhat, but the second thing I didn't pick up on at first, but basically, this person was talking about sleepaway camp and kind of checked all the boxes where they were saying how this movie outwardly condoned had was condoning homophobic viewpoints, and basically that this movie was saying that, or was comping this attitude that, you know, it's this movie is like morally promoting, you know, that people who are gay, people who are transgender are essentially serial killers. They're gonna grow up and become murderers and psychopaths because they're transgender, because they're gay, and was equating. And this person was saying that this movie was promoting those, like, you know, horrendously awful um, stereotypes that being gay or being transgender is inherently like wrong and evil, and that if you are gay or transgender, that, you know, you are likely, you know, you're going to become a psychopath, and you're deranged, you're going to become a killer, and was promoting, and that this movie was outwardly saying that about people who are gay or transgender. And I was just like, what? Like, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And I had just watched this movie, and I'm like, really? Like, are you serious? Because in this special features component, Robert Hiltzik and the whole cast, they do talk about this whole thing. And and I'm like, there's no way in hell that this movie does any of those things. This movie does not openly say that if you're gay, or if you're, you know, because the killer in this movie is transgender. It does not take a political or socio-political view, and saying that if you're transgender or gay, you're a vile and disgusting person, and that you're gonna start killing people because you're fucking crazy. Like, that's just insane. The circumstances around the film and the character, the creation of this character, was the parents and the family situation made this killer into who they were. And that, you know, at the time when this movie came out in '84, there wasn't really even a discussion on people who, you know, who were gay or transgender rights or gay rights, and that they're, you know, that, well, after all, the people who are gay and who are transgender are human beings. There's nothing wrong with them. That is completely a normal um, biological thing. They're not serial killers. This movie did not do anything in regards to promoting this attitude that they were inherently vile, and if you're gay, that you're going to become a serial killer. It did not. It was the situation of how this murderer, the killer in this movie, was kind of created, was through the insane behavior of the family that this girl was a part of. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, I just couldn't believe that. You know, it's like if you accuse somebody of being a Nazi, that's a pretty serious accusation. So you have to be able to back it up. And I'm like, there's no way that this movie is promoting that or saying that. And it's an exploitation movie. This movie was, Robert Hiltzik went out of his way to make something unique and different. And I think he really achieved that for what it is. But this movie is not, you know, promoting that fucking awful, you know, homophobic stereotype in any way, shape, or form. So, and, you know, you could say the same thing about Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. Like, you could say, it's like saying Jonathan Demme, you know, because Buffalo Bill is a transsexual. Well, Jonathan Demme set out to make this political statement that this is what homosexual behavior leads to, is that you're going to become a serial killer, which is fucking insane. This is it just happens that the character happens to be of this persuasion, It's part of the character. That's not. He's not making a political statement or a socio-political statement. There's no agenda there. He's a storyteller. And I just felt like at the end of the day, that's what this was. And I remember responding, and I left a comment with this person when they said that this movie is promoting that very idea that inherently being gay and transgender is evil and wrong, and that that if you are if you do consider yourself gay or transgender, you're going to inherently want to kill and murder people because you're fucking insane because you're gay. It's just like totally ridiculous. And I had said that this movie is not at all promoting that in any way, shape, or form. It's just a kick-ass slasher movie. It's pushing the envelope, but that's about it. And there was all this back and forth, and I'm like, okay, whatever. And then I posted a video in response, and I usually don't do these things. I posted a video in response, and then this person never, and I tried to do it in a really respectful manner, and I never heard back from this person. They never responded, and I was like, okay, fine, and I just dropped it, and then that was it, and then I just kind of left it as it was, and then that was it. So, but again, I do feel like in the beginning of the show, I kind of talked about that this is a movie that would probably be pretty hard, kind of challenging to be made today in this day and age, because unfortunately of those attitudes that prevail around, people wanting to, maybe create something out of nothing, reading into it and saying that there is some kind of conspiracy behind it, or there is some motivation, as opposed to like, well, no, it's just a low budget trashy slasher movie that pushes the envelope. So anyway, an amazing film. Sleepaway Camp rules. It is, if you're a slasher fan, it is an essential movie. Definitely get this. And I'm sure I got this a couple years ago, like I said, and I'm sure there are other versions of this movie on Blu-ray. I know there's a 4K version. I know that the other films in the franchise are also out, and I do believe, I'm not positive, but I think there are 3 Sleepaway Camp movies. It would be great to see them again. I totally forget what the second one is about or where it goes. I'm not even sure if it has the same cast or not. But I would love to see them again and buy them. Probably get all of the movies. There might be a 4th one, but I could be wrong. But I can't remember, and I'm not positive. But if you're a fan of slasher movies, and also horror exploitation movies, this is essential movie for your collection. So 1983 primetime stuff, one of the most influential slasher movies. Also, even considering how low budget this movie was, it was huge when it came out. When this movie came out, it was, I do believe it was in 1983 when this film came out, it was number 1 in the country, which is wild. When you have movies that are so shot for such little money and they have such an impact, where they can compete at a global level and actually outpace or do more business than bigger films, it's wild. But yeah, one of the classics right here. I love this movie to death. So thanks again, and this concludes my deep dive video for Sleepaway Camp. Peace.